All right, we're in pretty good shape here. You see we've done some sanding up here, and we've got a little bit more to do down here. I left a row of staples in just to give you kind of my philosophy on pulling them out. All the staples in this boat, probably at least 1,500 of them or so, were pulled out in less than an hour. So it's a simple process. You need some diagonal cutters, and you just want to take your finger, you want to push down on the top of it, not too hard, so that you can grip one corner of the staple. And then the trick is, yank it right out. Don't wiggle it or pull it, just yank it right out, okay? Simple enough to do. You can see that where we sanded here, you see where we left it, see the shine there? That's how you know you've sanded enough. So I don't like to keep all the audio and video equipment running while we're sanding, so I'm just gonna kind of talk you through how we did this. The first thing you're gonna do, as long as you're comfortable with your orbital sander, is take 80 grit paper and do one pass with 80 grit, and that's gonna get it all down to a fairly smooth shape. You're gonna see, you know, most of your seams between the strips go away, and it'll look like one continuous hull. Your staple holes will shrink down to almost nothing, and all the glue will be gone, okay? After you've done all that, and if you're not comfortable, remember, this is only a 1/4 inch seat of boat, so if you're not comfortable with 80 grit, use 120 until you do get comfortable. After you've done all that, what you're gonna do is take a rag and some warm water, and you're gonna soak the hull down. And this does a couple of things. The most important thing it does is it raises the grain of the boat. So what that'll do is all these little staple holes will start to shrink up and tighten up. And you're gonna come back after this is good and dry, and you're gonna do some filling, all right? The other thing this does, which is kind of exciting, is it starts to give you your first look. If you're gonna do your boat in bright work and you're not gonna paint the outside of it, it starts to give you the first look of what it's gonna look like. Remember, we threw in a couple of accent strips here with a white strip in the middle, and this is what it's gonna look like after it gets all epoxied and fiberglass. Okay. All right, so after, you gotta make sure that it comes up good and dry, and then we're gonna take some filler. In all these places, like up here in the center where they didn't meet absolutely perfectly, or down here towards the end, you're gonna see sometimes where the strips were twisted around, that there's a little tiny gap there. It doesn't affect the hull, but you're gonna wanna fill that before you put fiberglass in here, you know, and as I look, I see, you know, a couple little spots here and there. Right here's a strip where the cove peeled out a little bit, so, you know, I've got a little bit that I'm gonna have to fill there. You know, in general, don't go crazy with the filler that we're about to show you how to use, because the more you put on, the more you gotta take off. And the thing is, it dries really hard. So when you're, excuse me, it's a little bit more difficult to sand than just cedar. And you gotta be careful, because as you're sanding that, you know, sandpaper tends to go to the softest available material. It takes the easiest path. So, you know, when you're sanding it, make sure you stay focused on the hard stuff and you get that sanded down and you're not grinding away at the cedar on either side of it. Okay, so I am going to get some epoxy mixed up, and we're going to have a little epoxy class now because you're going to be using this throughout the rest of this process in different forms, one or another. And interestingly enough, it seems to be the part of the process which kind of freaks people out the most. And there's really no reason for that. Epoxy is nothing more than a glue. But it's a glue that sticks really well to itself. It sticks really well to fiberglass, and it's got a low viscosity. If you get the right kind, it's got a low viscosity. So it'll seep right through, and it takes that fiberglass and bonds it to the wood, you know, really well. So as long as you just follow the simple steps that we're going to show you, you're not going to have any problems whatsoever. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit more wiping down on this thing, pull up the rest of these staples, and then we're going to mix some epoxy up and fill a couple of holes. All right, so epoxy 101. It doesn't matter if you're buying epoxy 15, 20 gallons at a time, or if you're getting just the kit from us to get your boat done. All works the same. It's two-part system. It's a hardener and it's the resin. Now, in the stuff we sell and the stuff that we put out there, it's all non-blushing, low viscosity for laying up a cloth. If you want to get your own, that's fine. Just be careful. Make sure it's the right stuff. You know, every now and then we get a heartbreaking call from a customer who bought, you know, he thought he got bad advice, and he or she would buy polyester resin instead of epoxy resin. And if you do that, you really got a problem, because it's not going to stick to your boat for more than a year or two, and then it becomes a real hassle. So if make sure whoever you're getting it from knows what they're talking about, and you feel really comfortable with what it is that they're selling you and how to use it, okay? Even in the epoxies, you know, whether it's West System, System 3, Reka, Moss, those are probably the big four. There are different formulas, right? This is a 2-to-1 mix. Some of them are 5-to-1 mix. Some of them blush, some of them are non-blush. So one of the reasons that we use this both here in the shop and the stuff that we send the customers is it's simple, it's almost foolproof, it's non-blushing, so you don't have those extra steps of getting away the waxy buildup. If you get it, no matter who you get it from, you should have pumps, and they're all going to be calibrated probably differently from one guy who's selling them to you to another. These pumps are a simple 1-to-1 push, right? So if I need 2 parts of resin to 1 part of the hardener, I'm simply going to give 2 pumps for this, and make sure that you are consistent when you're pumping. So there's 1, let it rise all the way to the top, give it another 1. Okay, now you've seen that I'm working with a see-through cup here. And I put marks on this. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 ounces. I do that for a couple of reasons. First, you know, normally I will just pump to 1 ounce and then 1.5 or whatever it is that I need, rather than rely strictly on the pumps. You notice that there was a little sputter there. You know, that's not really enough to make a difference in the epoxy, so I wouldn't get too worried about it. But you know, I just typically use the marks, and that way there I know if I put in 3 ounces of one, that I need 1.5 ounces of the hardener, or if I put in 4 ounces, then I need 2. You know, it's pretty simple math to do there. All right, so right now I'm looking at just about 1.5, which means I gotta be right around 2 3/4 here. Whoops. There we go. All right, 2 1/4 I meant, I'm sorry, not 2 3/4. So put a little more to take care of that sputtering problem. And there we go. Okay, so that's it. And from there we just start mixing. Now, a friend of mine actually is the owner of an epoxy company. And years ago I asked him, how do you know how much to mix it? And he says, it's easy. You just mix it, mix it, mix it, mix it until all the striations are gone. And then when you think you've mixed it enough, you mix it a little bit more. So I'm going to try to give you a better answer than that. You're going to mix it definitely until all the striations are gone. What the striations mean is a slightly different color between the hardener and the resin. The hardener is just a little bit darker. So when you mix it up, any lines or striations that you see in there should be completely gone. Okay. So we're going to mix all that up real good. Now, once you have this epoxy, you have to decide what it is you're going to be doing with it. Now, one of the first things that I need to do on this boat is some glue up. So, when you're gluing, the best possible way to glue 2 pieces of wood using epoxy, I'll just grab a couple of pieces here. There we go. So for demonstration purposes, I will take a little brush here. Take the clear epoxy mixture and brush that on both surfaces. If it's a hardwood, you know, you want to be relatively liberal because it's going to soak it up, and you want to make sure that there's plenty in there. Epoxy's not like regular yellow glue or white glue. The idea isn't to squeeze the heck out of it. You just want the 2 pieces of wood to make good, firm contact. All right, so we showed you a little bit of this when we were doing up the stems. Okay, after that, you need a filler. Now, as the glue, just what we did will work pretty well. But if you have wood where there might be a little bit of a gap here, a little bit of a gap there, or you'll see that we'll be doing fillets along this boat, or we need to fill a little bit of holes, then you have to use fillers. Now, this is a wood flower, more common, and this is microbeads. They do functionally the same thing, but they do them very differently. Wood flower, yeah, probably the more common call I get about wood flower is, can I just use the stuff that comes off my sander? Yeah, you can, but that's a lot coarser than wood flour. Wood flour is, well, it's got the consistency of flour, like white flour that you have in your house. So very fine, very powdery, but it is wood and it is structural, so that when I mix this with the epoxy and I put that into a crevice or I put that into a hole or whatever, it's actually strong and it's structural, okay? Microbeads, these little glass beads, are not structural, but they sand really well. So this particular boat, we're probably going to be painting the outside of either this one or the other one or both of them. And one of the things I like to do is after you do your sanding, if there's like little bit of bump, or you can see a little bit of the grain of fiberglass cloth in there, if you take this with the pushers or the spatulas and you just give it a coat along the boat and then you do a final sanding, it'll make the surface of that boat look like glass. So this sands really well, but it's not structural at all, so you wouldn't use it for, you know, fillets where you need any kind of strength. Wood flour, on the other hand, is structural, and we got some stuff that we need to fill up, and we got some glue that we need to make, so we're going to throw some of that in there. Okay. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is finish gluing these two pieces of wood together that we have here. So I am going to mix this up really, really well. And again, I'm not looking to make this too thick, and I want it to be a little bit runny because I'm not filling any big voids or big holes. All right, so once I've done that, what I will do on these two pieces of wood is go back and on one side paint up with a little bit of the thickened epoxy. And what that does is it gives it a little bit of body, so that when I put the two of them together, if there's any space between the two of them, that should take care of it. Okay. So I'm going to come back here tomorrow, and you try to take those two things apart. That wood will break before the epoxy will. I've been doing this long enough to know that that's not a guess, that's a fact. Okay, now to actually fill holes on a boat. I'm going to put some gloves on here because I don't want to get any of this on my hands. And some people have a sensitivity to epoxy, so you really ought to be using these. And yeah, I'll tell you this a number of times while we're working on the boat, especially things when we're doing epoxy or glue ups. Do not be wearing clothes that you're concerned about. Not even if you think you can get away with a quick little job, because I've done it a number of times in my life, and I have a closet full of ruined shirts and pants and even sneakers that have epoxy on them. And what it does is the epoxy dries very hard and very brittle. So if that epoxy lands on this shirt and it dries, it'll dry so brittle that I can crack it and make a hole in my shirt. So once you've done that, if you've done that to your favorite shirt has just become your favorite epoxy shirt. Okay, so I need to go a little bit thicker here in order to fill some cracks. So I'm going to take another one. Remember, it's a lot easier to put more in than it is to take it out. So what I am trying to accomplish here for filler is to get something which is not so thick that I can't spread it, but it's thick enough so that it's not going to run down the side of the boat when I try to use it. All right, so that's still running too much. I'm going to take a little bit more, throw it in, and I think this is going to be just about perfect. All right, so it is effectively creamy peanut butter, maybe a little bit runnier than creamy peanut butter. All right, so now I'm going to take this over to the boat and show you a couple of spots where are very typical to having to fill. All right, so let's go fill a couple of spots. So this is a real typical spot where you're going to have to do a little bit of filling. You know, where eventually we're going to be putting some bedding compound here, which is nothing more than this. And then we're going to be putting our outer stem on and screwing it down and doing all that. But before we do that, you can see that there's, you know, a little bit of space here on some of these. And that's just where we didn't bevel our angle perfect. You know, it made good glue contact, but it didn't match the angle perfectly. So all we're going to do is fill that in, push it right down inside of that. All right, now the thing is with epoxy is, again, it dries very, very, very hard. So after we go ahead and squeeze all this in, all up and down here, we're gonna come back and clean it all off. You notice that I'm using a very cheap, inexpensive plastic putty knife. Best thing to use. Because this stuff will stick to steel, and if you have a really nice putty knife, it'll probably not be very usable when you're done for other puttying projects. So I recommend getting these really inexpensive ones. Here we buy them by the hundreds. All right, so that's it. You can see I'm just basically filling up the hole and pushing it down inside of there, and then this will be dry in about a day and a half, but I'll let it go about 2 days, let it get good and dry. If you try to sand this before it dries out, all it does is gum up a whole lot of sandpaper, and it doesn't sand very well. Epoxy is a heat catalyst, it's heat activated, so if before it's dry enough to sand you start throwing sandpaper to it, it reheats it and makes it mucky again. So you know, sometimes you can get away depending on the temperature. If it's 80, 90 degrees outside, a day from now this will be ready to sand. If it's 70, 65 degrees out, you're going to want to give it a couple days. If it's less than that, you probably want to give it 3 or 4 days. Okay, so that's a really typical spot to have to fill. I'll come back and clean this up in a minute. In the meantime, I want to show you a couple other places on the boat that are really typical. So here's an example of a strip we put in that knew it had a little issue to it, but again, you know, we were building this boat out of strips that we weren't going to send to customers anyway, so we used it. And so I knew when I put it on that I would be coming back and basically filling that in. So you just go over it, fill it in, come back, scrape off all the excess, because you know, better you do it now than have to sand off big clumps, because you'll be grinding away at that cedar, and you really don't want to do that if you don't have to. All right, so always leave it nice and neat, so then when it dries, all you have to do is a light sanding on it. Don't try to fill all the staple holes, because after you wet it and it expands and dries up, you're going to go back and give it a sand, and they're going to pretty much disappear anyway, and you're really not looking to cover this whole boat with this. Okay, so a notorious spot is up here along the center where the strips don't meet absolutely perfectly, and so we're gonna fill that in as well. Again, try not to go too wide, don't go too much on either side, because all that's gonna do is make for more sanding. Here's a perfect example where every now and then you're gonna have a little bit of a chip out of your bead or your cove, not your bead. So again, you know, just a little dab there. Scrape off all the excess. When you sand all this out, I'm telling you, you're not gonna notice it. It's like it's not even there. Okay, so you're gonna find a number of spots like this. If you're using really good strips, you know, you may have 10 or 15 of these little pucker marks that you gotta fill for the most part. If you didn't do a great job on your strips, then you might have quite a few more. So I'm pretty much done because I wet this out. Now, I will say that because we're filming, we're doing things just a little bit out of order here. And normally this happens after you've wet the entire hull down, you've given it a chance to dry. Don't ever put epoxy on wet wood. That's just a really bad thing. So after you sand it with the 80 grit, wet it all out, let it dry, go back and fill all your areas that you need to put epoxy on, the stem, the back deadwood skag on this boat, down the middle, and any little pucker marks there. Then let that dry for, you know, depending on your temperature, anywhere 1 or 2 days. And then come back with 120 grit paper, sand the entire hull down again. At that point, you should be ready to put a layer of epoxy on there and then fiberglass your boat. Okay, so I got to be careful and kind of dance around these epoxy areas, but I'm going to finish pulling these staples now and then wet out the rest of the hull, and we'll come back tomorrow and we'll put some sandpaper to it and finish filling these epoxy holes, these little holes with epoxy.